Welcome to Supervision. My name is Robert Farrell, and I'm a licensed professional counselor supervisor in the state of Texas in the area of Montgomery County. And if you are watching this, then you are more than likely one of my LPC associates. And if you're not one of my LPC associates, then I hope you enjoy the supervision session that we're about to have some instructional aspects on. If you are one of mine, then I probably ask you to watch this one. We will be discussing these, of course, in more detail in our individual sessions or in group. However, this is an opportunity to allow us to learn and grow and develop more understanding and insights into different areas. I began this process some months ago, and it's been a few weeks since I made one, but I want to do one today on grief and loss and how you as a counselor, how it affects you and how you can go about doing your counseling through grief and loss. We're going to be looking at some aspects here of what you can expect. I want to begin by looking at some images of grief and loss. Some of these, I think, are extremely powerfully expressive of what people experience. I put this one last mainly because the imagery that it gives, not only does one person die, but something grows out of it, out of the event, out of the loss. These are very strong images. And for those that have experienced grief and loss, you can probably connect to one of them. So what we're going to cover in this session includes these 6 areas of discussion, how grief is a natural phenomenon. We're also going to be looking at the stages of grief. Of course, everyone has studied them in school. If you had psychology class, if you've had anything like that as an undergraduate, you've heard of the stages of grief. Of course, you've all covered them in your training to become a counselor. We're also going to be looking at the DSM-5 text revision on prolonged grief and the bereavement disorder that's been added. We'll also look at what grief counseling is and how it's done. Also, we're going to have to look at spirituality issues because here in this one area of life, we cannot exclude spirituality from our counseling. And lastly, we're going to look at grief resources. So like I said, grief is a natural phenomenon. It is one that everyone will experience. And for most individuals, if they're over the age of, I'm going to say 30, they more than likely have experienced to a certain extent already losing a grandparent, a parent, a sibling. Everyone experiences this at some point in their life. There's lots of causes to it. Not only is grief a part of the life and death scenario, we're all going to die. As they say, there's only 2 actual realities, and that is death and taxes. Some people make light of it that way. But there are many causes to grief. We can lose things, lose people, lose jobs, lose relationships, marriages, you name it. There's all kinds of things that we can grieve over. But there is a difference between losing something. Let's say your team didn't win the Super Bowl. It's a little bit different. Okay, yeah, you're going to have some disappointed feelings for a day or so, but that's about it. When we're dealing with grief and we're talking about grief work, then we're talking about real loss, the loss of life, the loss of someone important to us. But the feeling of grief is oftentimes related to losing anything for any reason. There's lots of different symptoms: sadness, depression, anger, guilt, shame, resentment, bitterness. The list can go on and on. And because of that, there's lots of physical signs that go along with it. Physical shaking, loss of energy, demonstrating emotional outbursts. There can be increased or decreased amounts of sleep, eating more, eating less, working more, working less, drinking or using drug use that goes up or maybe stops. There are a lot of indicators that a person is dealing with grief, and not only are they going to be observable, but they're almost palpable. You can almost feel the emotional tension from someone that is grieving. It just pours off of them when it's a chronic, prolonged, or complex situation and scenario. I want to go back to the natural phenomenon for just a moment. This is such a common experience that there have been books written on it, poems written on it. There's nothing really new about it. But as we will see, it has some unique qualities to it that must be understood in order for you to work with your client who is grieving. So the original work, of course, as you all already know, was done by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and was oftentimes referred to as the stages or a cycle of grief. Common idea was it would begin with denial, avoidance, confusion, shock, fear, moving into anger, frustration, anxiety, and irritation, and then into depression, overwhelmed, helplessness, hostility, and a flight from the reality. Bargaining, fourth stage, struggling to find meaning in the event, reaching out to others, being able to share one's own life story. And finally, reaching acceptance, exploring options, finding new plans in the life that was left. I think it's important that we recognize that the original work done by Kubler-Ross was, in effect, on those that are dying, not those that were left behind and still alive. And so that early work was, I think, very well done, but also at the same time was taken out of context and applied to those that were left living after their loved one had passed away. And the same pattern doesn't exactly follow her findings. So when someone asks what grief really looks like, I think this is the best image you're going to find of grief. It goes in, yeah, there is shock, there is awe, there is numbness and denial, emotional outbursts, anger, fear, searching for understanding and meaning, a feeling of disorganized chaos, and then just pain, panic, loneliness, guilt, isolation, depression, and then hope, helping others, finding new relationships, realizing that we're not the only ones that have experienced a loss that is extremely catastrophic for those of us that were involved. Now, I do want to take a moment and mention that if you have personal experience of your own grief, you can, as we've talked in other videos about self-disclosure, you can open that up. Let your client know that you've experienced your own grief. You can share some of your experience, but we have to remember the grief work is their work time. You're the counselor at this point, which means if you're dealing with your own grief, you're not going to be much good to help them deal with theirs. Now, let me get transparent a little bit more. I have experienced this myself. As a part of just being older, I have found that in losing my wife, that happened years ago, I went through all of this image, and it lasted for a good bit of time. It lasted for close to 2 years. And we're going to talk in a moment about the new definitions in the DSM, which would put me in that category. However, what it really looks like and feels like is different for every individual. That's why the scribbly lines make so much more sense than what we saw with the stages in the grief cycle that Kubler-Ross came up with. Ultimately speaking, as a counselor, if you are dealing with your grief and loss and you need to take time off from work to deal with it, then that's what you need to do. I know there was about a 6-month period of time where I was not capable of helping anyone. And so I had to take a 6-month hiatus from counseling to deal with my own. And that was after I had gotten certified before she died as a grief specialist. This is something that no amount of training can prepare you to deal with on your own. That was my experience. Everybody's is different. Okay, so the DSM-5 text revision has modified and added this aspect of prolonged grief, also referred to as a prolonged complex grief bereavement disorder. There's a couple of categories here that we need to look at, the diagnostic criteria, and I'm going to go through them with you as you listen. So in the first aspect, Part A, the individual has experienced the death of someone with whom they are very close. That's a primary ingredient. So in this diagnosis, we're not talking about someone losing a loved one through divorce or losing a job or anything like that. This is specific to the loss of a loved one who has died. Category B, following the death, at least one of the following symptoms must be experienced more days than not during a 12-month period of time that causes significant clinical distress. First, a persistent yearning or longing for the deceased. With children, this can be observed in their play, how they react, how they engage. Number 2, intense sorrow and emotional pain. There again, that's an individual aspect, very subjective, and you want to ask them. Number 3, a preoccupation with the deceased individual. In other words, they just cannot stop thinking about them and placing them in their daily activities and thoughts. Number 4, a preoccupation with circumstances of the death of the individual. So in this category of B, we have to have one of these. In some cases, there will be more. Category C, following the death, there needs to be at least 6 symptoms of these next 2 areas. Okay, so that, again, 12 months or longer. So there's 2 categories that I saw here. One is on distress to the death. The other one is on social and identity disruption. So each one has 6 criteria, and we have to have a total of 6 altogether combined. These include marked difficulty accepting the death, in other words, denial, experiencing disbelief and emotional numbness, difficulty or impossibility with a positive reminiscence. In other words, the person falls apart just thinking about the person or having memories of things that took place. Number 4, bitterness or anger related to the loss. That one can be extremely debilitating for individuals, and I personally think that's one of the earmarks of having a difficult prognosis. You're going to have a lot of work on your hands helping them do their grief work. A maladaptive appraisal of self in relation to the deceased person. In other words, there's a lot of self-blame that's happening there. Number 6, excessive avoidance of reminders. That is to say, avoidance of the individual, places, situations, thoughts, feelings. And I've seen this not only in movies but in personal experience with clients where they are unable to look at the pictures of their loved one. They're unable to go into the bedroom of their loved one. They close it off. They don't allow things to change. They get locked, basically. So let's move into the social identity disruption category. A desire to die with the deceased person, very intense. Um, Number two, difficulty trusting others since the loss of that loved one. Third, feeling alone or detached from other individuals following the loss of the loved one. Fourth, feeling that life is meaningless or empty without that loved one in their life. Or the belief that you just can't not keep going. The ability to continue functioning is just not there. Five, confusion about one's life role, diminished sense of purpose and identity, um, the feeling that a part of you has died with that individual. Number six, difficulty or just a reluctance in pursuing interests after the loss of the loved one. Now, I think it's real important to recognize in category C, of these 12, we have to have 6. But what makes it different than regular, normal grief is that there is a 12-month indicator. So it's normal to experience all 12 of these last things for a period of time. Well, what's considered unhealthy is when that is experienced continually beyond 12 months. So in other words, the desire to die with the person is still there 12 months later, 18 months later, 2 years later. The feeling that life is empty or meaningless after a year of them being gone. The bitterness and anger of that person's death lingering and staying for up to and beyond a year. That 12-month year is the real indicator here. And we also have to put in some bereavement specifiers about traumatic injuries and deaths due to a trauma, specifically with regards to homicide, suicide. Those can make things even more complex. The common things that are run into there that the grieving person is struggling with is their degree of suffering. Was there mutilation or injury? Was there a malicious intent for the person's death, such as in a homicide? What was happening to the deceased at that last moment? Those are things that can really be complicating with regards to a traumatic death. Some associated features now that are included would be things like hallucinations, auditory and visual, of the deceased person, seeing them sitting in their favorite chair, being in the kitchen when they're usually there. It's very common for people to experience that moment where they reach for their phone or they go to, they see something new and they're feeling good about it. They look to their side where that person usually would have been and they're no longer there, and the stark reminder is brought back very harshly. And so some of those avoidance features are hallucination in a sense. Also, the body's somatic complaints, stomach issues, digestive issues, pain, fatigue, those can be experienced by individuals as well. Now, here's where the complexity comes in: is if the individual had a prolonged illness, such as cancer or other issues, where they were struggling with physical pain, suffering, and the like, the one that is then experiencing the prolonged grief may also experience those sensations. Some differential diagnosis things that need to be looked at would be normal grief. Here again, the 12 months time period is really, really important time to look at. Also, depression. You really want to be cautious because major depressive disorder, dysthymia, and those other types of depression, and they can really muddle up the picture. So if they're already involved then you have to take them into account first and decide which one's which. Also want to look at post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of the symptoms of PTSD appear similar to those of the symptoms of prolonged grief. Both conditions involve intrusive thoughts and avoidance. The primary difference here is that PTSD revolves around traumatic events with intrusive memories of the event, whereas the complex bereavement focuses on the relationship the individual that has died. Again, avoidance is involved in both PTSD and bereavement issues, and so we have to kind of tease that apart a little bit and see where they are different. So your differential diagnosis there, you want to be kind of cautious on that one. So let's talk for a little bit about grief counseling itself. What is it and how do you do it? So first of all, the what. Grief counseling is, depending on your theory, a very specific process of doing grief work, whereby the person is able to work through and express feelings, both emotional as well as physical sensations concerning that specific person that's passed away. Other aspects of grief counseling can be included. However, the what you're going to do is really going to be determined in the how category. So let's talk about that one for a moment. How are you going to do it? Well, just like other forms of counseling, the therapy that you'll use is going to be based upon your theoretical orientation. So if you're more of a cognitive behaviorist, you're going to want to use more cognitive behavioral aspects. I will talk more about the emotional focused approaches because that's what I am. I use EFT most often. So as you're going through this, certain themes will need to be addressed. Those can include the circumstances of the death, the timeliness of it. They may want to create a timeline of events, especially if their death took over a period of time, such as for cancer, from the date of diagnosis to the date of actual demise. Some of those other themes you might want to look at would be the suffering. How long did they suffer? What were they suffering with? What aspects of it? Going into detail. Also, what we're doing is we're really providing an opportunity for the client to say a very slow goodbye. And it takes them some time. Some of the techniques that you can use in that category would be an open chair or a two-chair technique. Open chair with the deceased loved one would be a good approach to use once you have helped them develop their emotional regulation skills. A two-chair technique is a great way to go where you're helping them develop the emotional awareness and dealing with each individual emotion and physical sensation. Also, some other aspects that we need to look at is specifically dealing with details of emotions. Okay, so if they're anger, bitterness, resentment, frustration, sadness, shame, guilt, you name it, you're going to want to bring those up and discuss them and put them, kind of put them on a hot spot and say, hey, let's talk about this aspect for a moment. Where are you now? Remembering what grief image really looks like. It's that squirrely rat's nest of emotions that goes all over the place. One day they may say, well, I'm not feeling angry today. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just feeling really, really sad. Well, 2 weeks later, they may come into your office just bursting with anger and bitterness and frustration. And then a couple weeks after that, they may be completely full of shame or guilt, depending on what took place. So one of the things you're going to be doing as a part of that process of the how is normalizing the grieving process. I personally like to suggest a lot of education is involved. We educate them about what they're going to go through. And then it's so well studied and so well understood after several thousands of years of people passing and us learning how to continue living that we can point out to them that what they're going through is in fact common. Now, notice I didn't say it's normal because if we're dealing with more than a year and they're meeting the criteria for the DSM-5's revision and addition of prolonged grief, then we can say that it's no longer normal, but it is common. Okay. One of the things I didn't mention is the prevalence. I believe the number was like 2.4% of the population is going to experience prolonged grief. So as you're working with them, educate them about what they're dealing with, which means you may have to go back and learn yourself. We'll talk about those resources in a little bit. So dealing with specific emotions such as depression, we also want to address thoughts of suicide, thoughts of self-harm, actions of self-harm, taking steps to hurt other people as well. For example, I've worked with folks that have been involved in motor vehicle accidents that were brought on by someone under the influence, and they would become extremely homicidal for a brief period. And those are scary moments when you're working with them. So you have to be prepared to maintain a safe place emotionally, but let your clients know you are required by law to make a 911 call if they say, hey, I'm going to off myself or someone else. And so we have to remind people that we want to help them be safe. We want to help them work through these emotions, and that there's going to be a certain way we will do that. There again, going back to your theory, what approach you're going to take. Okay, so let's talk for a moment about the spirituality aspects. This is one of those topics that cannot be avoided. You're going to have to talk to them about spirituality. I know that a lot of clinicians in the early stages of their experience as a counselor are very uncomfortable because they may not have enough knowledge and awareness about any one faith system. Here in this image, we've got several images here that I know personally and have experienced in my own life and know people and have learned a lot from them. We have Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Wiccan, and a few others there. I will admit I don't know all of the symbols, but I recognize many of them in this image. And I know a little bit about each and every one of them. Okay? And that's one of those important things. You need to know enough about the various cultural aspects and spiritual aspects of this normal, natural phenomena of grief. How does each one of those belief systems deal with and manage the grieving process? So we're also dealing with not just spirituality, but cultural concepts. For example, in America and in Europe, it is common during a grieving period to wear the color black. However, in a good bit of Asia, specifically Vietnam, it is the opposite. They would wear white as an indication of being in mourning, especially on the day of the funeral. Very, very common quality to it. Now, let's go there for a moment and look at how that cultural phenomenon crosses spiritual boundaries. For Asians, you will find there is Catholicism, Christianity, as well as Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism, all mixed in one country. So, for example, in Vietnam, you find Catholicism, Lavang. You also find Buddhism, you find Taoism, and Confucianism. And so, but yet they all share the same habit or the same cultural phenomenon of wearing white at a funeral, regardless of their spiritual faith base. So you need to be able to openly discuss your client's faith, their culture, how they would celebrate life, how they would mourn the death. What is it about them that allows them to experience this? Now, I personally believe this is a very powerful source for you to go into, and you don't have to be an expert in all of them. Your client is. They know their faith if you don't. Okay, so you have to ask them, what do they believe? All right, what's going on? Do they have reincarnation in their faith? Okay, Hinduism and Buddhism have that. Certain aspects of Judaism has that as well, especially if they go into the Kabbalah aspects of that faith. So what you're looking at here, spirituality speaking, is not something to be afraid of, but it's something to help your client embrace. And that way they can gain strength from their own resource of their faith and reaching into their own faith community. Okay, so we're almost done. We've looked at quite a few topics. We've discussed the how and the what of grief counseling. We've looked at the grieving process, that it's not clean, it's not step by step or stage by stage, that it's very circular and they're bound back on a frequency of experiences. So let's go for a moment and look at resources. What is out there? Now this is just a simple snippet that I took from the SAMHSA webpage. There's phone numbers, and honestly speaking, there's so many out there I could not bring them all up. Do a simple Google search. You will be amazed at what is available on this topic. That's how natural a phenomenon is. Everyone hurts. Everyone's going to experience grief. If you haven't yet, it's just a matter of time. It will be something that has to be dealt with as a part of life. So phone numbers, websites. I would like to also bring up, I mentioned momentarily ago about the aspects of spiritual faith-based communities. Many of them have within their doors their own systems of dealing with grief and support groups that are there. For example, the group Grief Share is a very strong and growing support system. I've been to Grief Share a couple times for myself, as well as a couple times to support other individuals. It's a great system. It's really, really amazing. Additionally, the American Cancer Association Society, they have their own grieving training and resource system. You can look them up online. But the resources, there's so many available, and they are also regional. So depending on what part of the state you're in, what part of the county you're in, what city you're in, you may find other resources that aren't available in other locations. So that's to be taken into account as well. You're going to want to put together about 4 or 5 resources that you can hand out to people. What I usually will do is during the middle of a session, I'll turn around to my computer and look them up while they're sitting there, and even create a list of places to call and where to go. It can be very, very beneficial at that moment to hand them a piece of paper that can say, here are places to go that you can get help from. So you want to have a list of resources that you can provide. Now, if you're working in a hospital setting or an outpatient setting, not a private practice setting, but in a facility, then you're definitely going to want that resource handout that you can just hand to people. Maybe even circle a few as you hand it to them, say, here, check these ones out. These are good places to look, specific for them. But you'd be surprised. It really instills hope that they can come out of their grief and develop into a new idea of what life is going to have to be like.